Welcome back. We just walked through some of the basic concepts of Marxian political economy, in particular the principles of accumulation. In the second half of the lecture, I introduce you to Glen Sean Coulthard's description of how primitive accumulation relates to North America and rural sociology today. I have chosen Coulthard because his work neatly ties together what we have learned about settler colonialism and slavery during the last 2 weeks of the course. Coulthard is an indigenous Dene political scientist who mostly writes about settler colonialism and indigenous resurgence in Canada. But his analysis is just as applicable for the United States. As we will see, Coulthard is critical of Marx in many ways, but doesn't reject him wholesale. Instead, he takes the basic observations of Karl Marx as a starting point to develop his own argument. This is a good model of how we can engage the work of Karl Marx critically, no matter how we stand on his political beliefs. Coulthard begins by reiterating that settler colonialism in North America is ongoing because it continues to dispossess indigenous peoples. He then describes primitive accumulation as a form of colonialism in which non-capitalist peoples, such as peasants and indigenous peoples, are dispossessed of their means of production, their means to subsist. It is this connection to colonialism that makes primitive accumulation an attractive framework for indigenous peoples to describe the origin of capitalism and their own dispossession in America. Coulthard then goes on to critique Marx in 3 ways. First, he points out that the term primitive or original may be misnomers because the dispossession that primitive accumulation describes is not exclusively prior to capitalism, but integral to it. Only by continuously exploiting people and non-human beings that are outside of the capitalist mode of production, capitalism is able to expand. This is a point also made by feminist scholars such as Rosa Luxemburg and later Maria Mies and Veronica Benhart-Thompson, who point out that women's domestic labor, which is not wage labor, is exploited by capitalism so workers can go to work well rested and cared for. They also show that capitalism depends on the ongoing exploitation of environmental resources that have not been commodities until they have been mined, pumped, or cut, a form of modern-day enclosure of common goods. David Harvey coined the term accumulation by dispossession to describe how in capitalism wealth is generated by ongoing expropriation of common property. Let me give you 2 examples. Throughout the United States, municipal water utilities are being privatized as a way to raise public funds and to organize water supply more efficiently. Whether water privatization can actually realize these goals is debated, but it is unquestionable that it turns a formerly common good, water, into a commodity. So whatever private utility companies are profiting beyond what they pay for their water rights is essentially a dispossession of public wealth by a private company and the state agencies that facilitated the privatization. Another example are extensions of intellectual property, for example, intellectual property over genetic material of agricultural crops. Relatively recently, agri-food companies have found ways to declare the genetic material of certain plants that they have bred as their intellectual property, which prohibits farmers from saving the seed and reuse it in the future. Not only is seed saving a millennia-old aspect of agriculture now made difficult by intellectual property law, it is also the origin of patented plant varieties. No doubt that plant breeding companies add a little extra to these plants that they deserve to be reimbursed for. But critics point out that intellectual property over seeds appropriates millennia of collective plant breeding by generations of farmers, which generates tremendous profits for seed companies of a formerly common good. Coulthard's second critique has to do with Marx's judgment that primitive accumulation and capitalism are necessary steps in society's evolution towards an egalitarian, classless society. For Marx, pre-capitalist societies were backwards and primitive. Of course, this is unacceptable for indigenous peoples who have their own ways of organizing their societies and who have no desire to enter the capitalist mode of production to maybe, one day, arrive at some sort of utopian society based on European philosophy. Coulthard's third critique of Marx has to do with the means of accumulation. For Marx, primitive accumulation was achieved by overtly violent and coercive means. And while this was historically true in America in the way white settlers appropriated the continent, it is no longer the dominant form of dispossession. Scholars as diverse as Antonio Gramsci and Michel Foucault posited that capitalism can reassert itself not just by coercion, but by ideological means that make working class people believe that they too benefit from capitalism. This goes back to the question I asked in the opening of this lecture. When we no longer can imagine a world without capitalism, we begin to accept its terms, maybe even support it. Coulthard contributes 4 ideas that make his observations so compelling in the context of North America. Most of these arguments have been made by other scholars, but few have linked them in the same way as Coulthard did. First, as explained earlier, capitalism in the Americas is inseparable from colonial exploitation. To ignore this means to erase the fact that much of the wealth of America originates on and from indigenous land. Second, Marx described primitive accumulation as a 2-part process consisting of enclosures, that is, dispossession of common property, and proletarianization, that is, people becoming dependent wage workers. Coulthard argues that Marx underplayed the significance of enclosures for present-day capitalist societies. At least in settler colonial countries like Canada and the United States, they are just as important for capitalist accumulation. This is a fair point. But we must not forget that labor exploitation is also central to capitalism, both today and in the past. This is why we talked about slavery last week, which provided American capitalist entrepreneurs with the cheapest possible labor, without which US capitalism would not have developed nearly as fast. And when we look at today, the fact that surplus labor produced by workers is accumulated by a capitalist elite rather than the workers themselves is as true as it ever was. Or how else do you explain that over 70% of the wealth in the United States is owned by 10% of the population, while the poorest 50% own only 1.5%? I leave it up to you to decide whether this is a good deal or a bad deal. Proponents of capitalism argue that it encourages competition and economic activity that creates wealth that will eventually trickle down to the working class, making everyone better off, regardless of inequality. Opponents say that this is outright exploitation and undemocratic, because with wealth comes power. Regardless of where you stand on this issue, it is obvious that the rich do not become rich by their own ingenuity, but by accumulating the wealth produced by their employees. The third idea that Coulthard provides goes at the heart of environmental sociology, one of world sociology's subdisciplines. Coulthard states that capitalism does not just exploit people, as Marx said, but the environment as well. There's no doubt that capitalism over the past 200 years developed so rapidly because of its exploitation of fossil energy. Much of the productivity increases in manufacturing, transportation, and agriculture aren't so much a matter of more efficient technologies, but simply a product of pumping non-renewable energy into these industries, such as coal, oil, natural gas, or nuclear power. What is known as the Green Revolution, the massive increase in agriculture productivity since the 1960s, was largely a result of nitrogen fertilizer, which is produced under enormous expenditures of energy. In many parts of the world, the Green Revolution also depended on depleting soil organic matter, another resource that has been built over thousands of years. So not only does capitalist production deplete finite resources, the burning of fossil energy is also the main driver of climate change, which makes our planet increasingly inhabitable. So Coulthard's argument that capitalism exploits the environment as much as it exploits humans seems quite accurate. Now, how this will pan out in the future is still to be seen. Some people hope that we will eventually develop technologies that are fully sustainable and powered by renewable energies. Pessimists fear that such technologies will not be developed in time and that the environmental collapse of our civilization is inevitable. And finally, there are those who argue that developing sustainable technologies is important, but that we don't have time to wait for them and would do better to transform our society towards something more equitable, less exploitive, less consumption-driven, and more sustainable, however such a non-capitalist system would look like. Finally, Coulthard points out that Marx's concept of the capitalist mode of production isn't as encompassing as he made it to be, that there are other forms of exploitation that Marx simply did not account for. Examples of this are exploitation along racial or gender differences. While some scholars explain capitalism as an economic system that operates through racial and gender-based exploitation, I think it is a fair warning not to try to explain every injustice using a single theory, such as Marxian political economy. I know this has been a lot of information today, but it really goes at the core of economic inequality today, in America and worldwide. Some people say this is simply the way it is and nothing can be done. Maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong. I can't predict the future. But by showing the historical origins of capitalism and the violent forms by which it is reproduced today, points to alternative forms of living together that are more equitable and sustainable, something that we can demand and try to implement in our own lives.